Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fifth lecture in the American Civil War series. And this is, of course, part of Dr. Tom's History and Politics channel here on YouTube. So if you like this video, which you are about to watch, if you could please, at the end of it, click on like, and also, if you're extra generous, subscribe to it. That would be much appreciated. All right, now today's topic is a bit of a standalone lecture, and we're going to be focusing not on an event, not on a year, but we're going to be focusing on just a movement in itself. The Southern Fire Eaters. So we've talked about the abolitionists, who are obviously the most radical people in the North at this time. Now we're going to start to look at the Southern Fire Eaters, who are the most radical people in the South. All right, so these fire eaters, I mean, the name just says it all. I mean, they're radical enough, perhaps crazy enough, that they will eat fire. And they completely embraced this nickname. They absolutely embraced it. And they were hardcore. And they typically came from very privileged backgrounds. They're people who have known power their entire life. And so as a result, they're also typically very arrogant, but they also are very well spoken in a lot of ways. But they are also, I'll say, some of them are very angry individuals, and we'll go into some more details about that as we go into the lecture. So I want to start by talking about Robert Barnwell Rhett, not his name at birth. Actually, born Robert Barnwell Smith, and he's a well-known Charlestonian. However, he's not born in Charleston. He's born from Beaufort, a slightly smaller city in the South Carolina Low Country, and also South Carolina, obviously, but born right at the turn of the 19th century. Now, he does move to Charleston, the big city in South Carolina, and he becomes the owner of the Charleston Mercury, which was the main newspaper at the time. And Charleston Mercury, unsurprisingly, had a very pro-Southern stance throughout its entire period of existence. It was a slightly hot-headed newspaper, when you look at the owner of it, and it's very pro-states' rights, it's very pro-Southern rights, it's very pro-slavery, and it looks back fondly in the experience the 1830s and the tariff crisis. So needless to say that the people who are writing for the Charleston Mercury and those who are reading for the Charleston Mercury are very big admirers of John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun does die in the 1850s, and as a result, we have a whole new set of characters. Don't think that when Calhoun died, that this hardcore Southern voice in American politics died with him. Far from it. These fire eaters will be following in his footsteps and raising hell as much as he did. And so I think Robert Barnwell Rhett is a very good example of that. Now, as I mentioned, Robert Barnwell Smith, that's his name at birth. Now, Mr. Smith becomes a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives in the 1820s. He'll serve in that position for 6 years, and he gets promoted to being the state attorney general in the mid-1830s, or about the time of the tariff crisis, and the time of Calhoun being the spokesman of the South. Now, Rhett was not terribly pleased at his original name of Smith. And he thought that the name Smith was not colorful enough. It was a bit bland. He thought that the name Smith didn't make him stand out at all and made him seem very ordinary. So he decided to take the very bold step of changing his surname, and he picked a very elegant sounding one, Rhett. So he changed his name to Robert Barnwell Rhett of Charleston, South Carolina in 1838. And at the time, he was early into his next job. He's now at the federal level of politics. He's serving the state of South Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives, which he will serve in that capacity all the way till he actually gets elected to the even higher chamber, the United States Senate, and he'll serve in that position, but not for long. Rhett was very opposed to the Compromise of 1850, of course, which we've gone into full details of that So it shouldn't surprise you that a fire eater like Mr. Rhett was very much against the Compromise of 1850, which allowed the state of California to enter into the Union as one single state, as a free state, tipping the balance of power in favor of the free states over the slave states. He didn't like that idea. Not even the Fugitive Slave Act was enough to get him on board. And he did vote against the Compromise of 1850. He was, unsurprisingly, very pro-slavery, a slave owner himself. And, give you an idea of how hardcore he was angry that South Carolina did not secede in the 1830s during the nullification crisis. So he looked back at the 1830s not as a source of pride of South Carolina standing up for itself. He looked back at it in anger, that was our chance to get out of this union and set up our own republic. And so ever since then, he was looking for any opportunity to push South Carolina and South Carolinians towards secession, to get out of the American Union once and for all. And so we get to the 1850s and things start getting real hot around Washington and everywhere in the United States for that matter. It doesn't surprise me, it shouldn't surprise you either, that he is going to continue to be very vocal on that issue and will therefore eventually serve on the state of South Carolina secession convention in 1860. Now, Rhett, let's take a look at what his other visions were. So this is a map of the state of South Carolina, and you can see the county maps there. Now, the areas which are red and crimson and pink, those areas are what a lot of people recognize as the Low Country. Now, the Low Country of South Carolina is different from the Midlands and the Upstate. The Low Country is very swampy. Originally full of rice plantations, end up being replaced by cotton, Sea Island cotton. It is without a doubt by far the wealthiest part of the state of South Carolina. It is one of the wealthiest regions of the United States before the American Civil War. To this day, the South Carolina Low Country remains the wealthiest area of the state of South Carolina. And a lot of very wealthy Americans have their second homes in the downtown Charleston area, and having their vacation homes on Kiowa Island and other nice summer hot spots in the South Carolina Low Country. And as a result, that's part of why Charleston doesn't really seem to have a neighborhood vibe around it the way it used to, because some of these houses are empty for so much of the year. And so it's become basically a city of second homes in a lot of ways, not fully, but much more so than it was in the 1980s and before. But Robert Barnwell Rhett was like a lot of Low Country South Carolinians, and he believed that the Low Country was superior to the rest of the state of South Carolina. Now, that's going a step further, because South Carolina had this attitude that South Carolina needs to be run by South Carolina and could operate as its own country, and South Carolina would do better on its own without the United States. And you could say thumb their noses at other Southerners as well. But the Low Country had a tendency to thumb their nose at the rest of the state of South Carolina. And Robert Barnwell Rhett was one of them. And there were even some fire eaters who, in this area, who thought that eventually perhaps the Low Country could even secede from the state of South Carolina. And so you can see the level of extreme here that some of these people had. Now, I don't want to make Rhett sound like a complete lunatic, but let's look at some of his quotes before we look at his house, give you an idea of how much wealth he accumulated in his lifetime. But let's take a look here at some of these quotes, which shows why history does not look back on him favorably, rightly so. And he is very pro-secession from the beginning. So look at this first quote. The real issue involved in the relations between the North and the South of the American states is the great principle of self-government. Shall a dominant party of the North rule the South? Or shall the people of the South rule themselves? This is the great matter in the controversy. So let's break this quote apart. So self-government of the southern states. He's advocating an independent South, independent of the United States. He is pushing for secession here. Now, let's take a look here. Shall a dominant party of the South the North rule the South. So he's now referring back to the Compromise of 1850, and keep in mind that is from that point that the North does dominate the South politically in Washington when California entered the Union as a free state, permanently tipping the balance in favor of the free states, the North. And the South is very much on the negative end of that stick. And Rhett knows that, but he knows that this actually creates an opportunity to push the Southerners to look for the exit door. And that's what that quote's about. Now, obviously, secession is not going to be entirely universally accepted. And look at this quote here. Let it be that I am a traitor. The word has no terror for me. I have been born of traitors, but thank God they have been traitors in the great cause of liberty, fighting against tyranny and oppression. Such treason will ever be mine whilst true to my lineage. No, no, my friends, smaller states before us struggle successfully for their independence and freedom against far greater odds. If it must be, we can make one long last desperate struggle for our rights and honor, etc., etc. And even saying, see on the end, even if we fail, at least we tried, and therefore it will be of no consequence. So you see, he does not mind being called a treasonist for advocating leaving the United States. He has no shame in that whatsoever. But look what I have been born of traitors. So what does that mean? That means basically that he is from the South Carolina lineage, which sees themselves as South Carolinians first and as Americans second. And South Carolinians, that is a theme that we see at this time, and not just of South Carolina, but a lot of the other states see themselves as Virginians first, as Alabamians first, as North Carolinians first, Georgians first, etc., etc. And so Rhett, in a lot of ways, although he is extreme, he does embody a lot of the common ideals of the time within the American South. He just takes it to a whole other level. So Rhett, that is his house. Now that lets you know that he obviously was very successful in accumulating wealth. It is a massive house right on the corner of Thomas Street and Vandross Street and downtown Charleston, not south of Broad Street, interestingly enough. So he can't take that claim to fame, but it is a very nice house nonetheless, and shows again how prominent a lot of these fire eaters were within their societies, that they were able to be this wealthy and to have such grand houses, which gave them status, you say in England, in their societies, and they were listened to largely as a result of that. Now, I don't want you to think that Rhett is one-man band here, and they're not all from South Carolina. A lot of them are, but some of them from other places, like this guy William Lowndes Yancey, and he is a Georgian by birth, but Yancey spends most of his life claiming to be an Alabamian, and that's because he moved there after he became a lawyer. He was very pro-slavery. What's interesting and what separates Yancey from people like Robert Barnwell Rhett is the fact that Yancey was not as early a fire eater as Rhett was. And he was actually very moderate in his views on Union, on the prospects of secession in the 1830s. And that's interesting because at the time of the nullification crisis, he did not stand by his fellow Southerners a couple states over in South Carolina. He did not support John C. Calhoun. He did not support South Carolina's refusing to pay the tariffs. And so it's interesting that he's very moderate this time, and that created a lot of splinter between South Carolina and other southern states, other state politicians, etc. But you get to the 1840s, and about the time of the Mexican War and the North's response to that, that's when Yancey suddenly hit the panic button and went into being a straight-up fire eater. Now, at the time, he was a member of state-level politics only. He was a member of the Alabama State House of Representatives and eventually the Alabama State Senate, but didn't take long for him to be recognized in Alabama as one of the spokesmen for the state in defense of states' rights and also of slavery. Now, Yancey does get elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for that state, and in that position is where he really became a very big lobbyist and enemy of Northern politicians. And not just of Whigs, not just of Republicans when they come around from 1854 onwards, but also even against his own party, members of his own party, the Democrats. And there is, as we mentioned in our last lecture, at the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas was not as vehement as these fire eaters in the defense of the institution of slavery in those debates in 1858. And that was recognized by these fire eaters who took advantage of it to help create a split between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And it is going to be a lot to do with Yancey as far as the split between the Northern and the Southern Democrats by the time we get to the presidential election in 1860, and handing the election to Lincoln in the process. But Yancey, something else that makes him stand out amongst Southerners is that he was very vocal and reopening the transatlantic slave trade with Europe and taking more Africans from West Africa and importing them to the American South, to other regions if they wish for them to go. And yeah, just deliver more slaves. And that was something that he always stuck to his guns on. And he is going to serve in a very prominent role for the Confederacy abroad, which we will get to, believe me, not too far down the road. So I'm going to hold fire on that bit now. Surprises will come later. But Yancey never ever goes back on this idea of reopening the transatlantic slave trade. Now let's look at some of Yancey's quotes. "Listen not then, my countrymen, to the voice which whispers as far yet it does not raise itself above a whisper, that Americans who have been knit together by so many cords of affection can no longer be mutual worshippers at the shrine of freedom, can no longer exist together citizens of the same republic." And so you can see here he's talking about in the 1850s how the North and South are becoming more and more distant from each other, that the connections between them are becoming fewer and fewer. And listen what he says about slavery. "If slavery is right per se, if it is right to raise slaves for sale, does it not appear that it is right to import them? Let us then wipe from our statute book this mark of Cain which our enemies have placed there. We want Negroes cheap, and we want a sufficiency of them so as to supply the cotton demand of the whole world." Now, here he is talking about trying to reopen the transatlantic slave trade, which even amongst most Southerners, most white Southerners, was something they did not agree with. And so Yancey is very extreme within Southern society, yet they continue to allow him to be a spokesman for him. Now, make sure we're clear here. "Let us then wipe our statute books this mark of Cain." Now, Cain, of course, the story in the Old Testament of Abel and Cain. This biblical story has Cain serving as evil, Abel as good, and hence the name Cain has become synonymous with evil, the devil, hell, all these things. And so that's why he's using that language. It's very prominent biblical language, which was used very often in those days. All right, now let's look what else he says about slavery. "You are allowed to whip your children. We are allowed to whip our Negroes. There is no cruelty in the practice. Our Negroes are but children. The Negro that will not work is made to work. Society tolerates no drones." So look at, again, this Yancey is promoting the paternalism argument that Southerners often use to defend the institution of slavery. And here you are, he's referring to blacks as children, incapable of making decisions on their own, incapable of looking after themselves. That is the job of the white master, the good white master, as Yancey and other prominent Southerners say. Indeed, a lot of preachers at the time did the same thing, that the white slave owners are giving the blacks for free food, clothing, and shelter, and that therefore gives them all the provisions they need to live a life, and they are also introducing them to Christianity. And so, again, promoting what John C. Calhoun said in that positive good speech in the 1830s, that slavery was a positive good. And look at what he says in the bottom quote. And he's very much talking about the fact that the South is going to have to perhaps look at something revolutionary in order to protect the institution of slavery permanently. And that is very, very important to understand. And so you can see here that Yancey is promoting a secession of southern states, bring about sudden, drastic change necessary to protect the institution of slavery. So even now, we're not at the secession crisis right yet, but you can see that secession is going to be for that purpose, to protect the institution of slavery. We can make no bones about that. Next, we want to look at Louis Trezevant Wigfall. Excuse me. All right, Trezevant Wigfall was born in South Carolina, Edgefield, in South Carolina upstate, and he was a lawyer. Interestingly, he had to move to Texas in 1848, and what's interesting as to why is because he had oversubscribed himself to duels, and his diary got a little too full, and therefore he had no choice but get out of South Carolina, or eventually one of those bullets is going to hit him and kill him. So he decided to get out, and he does serve in the Texas State Legislature, 1859 to 61, and of course, unsurprisingly, is a Democrat and a hardcore supporter of slavery and secession. All right, so let's look at some of Louis Trezevant Wigfall's quotes. His quotes are definitely shorter in number of words he used, but let's make no mistake about it. Trezevant Wigfall gets straight to the point when he's talking, and let's look at this first quote here. Dueling is an important factor in the improvement of both the morals and the manners of the community. Well, absolutely. Dueling is very much part of what makes you a Southern gentleman, someone who needs to be revered in society. And dueling is considered a very well-mannered action. It's rude to turn down a good duel, and it's rude to not offer a duel or to call a duel if necessity requires you to do so. But see, again, this just shows how hot-headed these fire eaters were. They were fearless, and they come across as not thinking about the consequences. And it's worth highlighting the connection between dueling and secession. Dueling is risky. It is very risky, and you might get shot. You might get killed. Not necessarily. Maybe you're going to shoot the other guy. Maybe you're both going to miss, in which case it was okay, and you'll live to see another day, one more day at least. And secession is very similar. It's very risky. You are making a gamble, and secession could lead to war. Wars bring a lot of deaths. War, if you win, okay, you've won, so you got what you wanted. But what if you lose? The consequences of that could be very dangerous. But these fire eaters don't seem to think about the consequences, just the positive results which could come from these actions. So dueling, you're putting yourself at risk getting killed, but with secession, you're at risk of your whole region suffering as a result, not just you. So there is very much a direct connection here, and the ways that these guys approach dueling and the way they approach secession. And look at what Wigfall says here about secession. I wish to live in no country where the man who blacks my boots or curries my horse is my equal. So basically, he doesn't want to live in the United States without slavery, because it seems very clear that he realizes that if you get rid of slavery, eventually blacks could have equal rights in American society. So if you get rid of slavery, that domino effect can start. And he does not want to have anything to do with that sort of society. So he is going to defend slavery to the death. Well, let's look at William Porcher Miles, another South Carolinian, another South Carolina fire eater. So he was from Walterboro, and he was a lawyer by trade. However, he also, during his spare time, managed to serve as a professor of mathematics at the College of Charleston. He also serves as the mayor of that city for a couple of years in the late 1850s. He steps down from that role because, well, the state of South Carolina is going to elect him to the House of Representatives in Washington. He will serve in that role until 1860, when the state of South Carolina does secede from the Union. And in that capacity as a representative for the Palmetto State, he does frequently refer to slavery as a, quote, divine institution. Now, before he got into mainstream politics, he was very critical within society of the Wilmot Proviso, thought that was an indication of what was to come as far as northern politicians becoming more and more hostile towards slavery and indeed the South. And after the Compromise of 1850, which he also is very critical of, he said that that was proof that there is nothing that the South can do to protect itself and its institutions except for secession. Secession was the only way to preserve the South. And so from 1850 onwards, he is going to promote exactly that. And so it's not a huge surprise, again, that like his colleague Robert Barnwell Rhett, he will serve on the state of South Carolina secession convention in 1860. Like Alabamian Yancey, Miles is also in favor of reopening the transatlantic slave trade, bringing the price of slaves down. So now let's look at some of his quotes. They are not contending for an abstract principle. They are not influenced by mere spirit of fanatical opposition to slavery. They are deliberately, intentionally, and advisedly aiming a deadly blow at the South. It is intended as a blow. It is intended to repress her energies, to check her development, to diminish and eventually destroy her political weight and influence this Confederacy. Now, let's take that quote apart. So what does William Porcher Miles mean by this? All right, so, well, first of all, he's saying that the North is trying deliberately not so much to destroy slavery. They're not trying to destroy slavery because they're humane. They're trying to destroy slavery because they want to destroy the South. And this argument is what he uses to say our only option is to head for the exit, to get out of this union and determine our own course of action for the future. Now, he mentions the word Confederacy in here. Just to clarify, this is not of the Confederate States of America he's referring to. That does not exist yet at the time of that quote. And what he's doing here, I mean, Confederacy, lowercase c, is a word that is very common in vocabulary back then and even today, meaning just a group of states. And he is already referring to these southern states as a confederacy, loosely leagued together with similar cultures, similar practices, similar viewpoints, who need to work together on this. Now let's see what he said about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The South may not dissolve the Union on the rejection of Kansas, but such rejection would assuredly sever still another of the cords, rapidly becoming fewer, which of course of events has been snapping one by one. Now you can't argue with Miles on that one. As the 1850s progresses, after each incident, the Compromise of 1850, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the publication of Frederick Douglass's newer biography, My Bondage, My Freedom, and on and on and on. Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas. The connections between the North and South are becoming fewer and fewer. That's not true just North and South, but North and Southern politicians are becoming less and less willing to build bridges, to reach agreements, to reach compromises. And in fact, it goes further. This is a problem growing within the Democratic Party itself. They are also starting to split between North and South. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. Roger Atkinson Pryor. Roger Pryor, we are now up in Virginia. Virginia, an upper South state, also has its fair share of fire eaters. And Roger Pryor is a very good example. Now, he's one of the younger fire eaters. So look, he's born in 1828, and so that means that by the time he is in the U.S. House of Representatives, he's 31 years old. But he was a very successful young'un, and he's from Petersburg, Virginia. He was a lawyer, and he does edit the newspaper called The South in Richmond, Virginia. Now, The South, that newspaper, was a big defender of the South, its culture, its institutions, slavery, and even promotes secession. He is one of the biggest advocates of secession. And what's interesting about his being so pro-slavery is actually Pryor himself did not own a single slave, but he was very defensive of the institution itself and thought it was something that was required for the South to be successful, for the United States economy to be successful. And he did not find any sins involved with the ownership of slaves. Now, he only served for 2 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, and that's because, well, he goes in there in 1859, and he's going to walk right out of there in 1861. Remember, that's the year that his home state of Virginia will secede from the Union. Now, this one, Edmund Ruffin, very interesting character, very eccentric. That's interesting to use the word eccentric because pretty much everyone we've talked about in this lecture so far has been eccentric in one way or another. But I mean, Ruffin, just look at him. Look at his eyes, his piercing eyes. This guy is very serious, very hardcore, very dramatic. So, like Pryor of Virginia from Prince George County, south of Richmond, and interestingly, he was a scientist by trade. His area of expertise was soils, nutrients in soil, that sort of thing. And so a lot of tobacco planters actually consulted him when it came to planting and advice for that. Ruffin himself was a tobacco planter, and he had his own plantation, and he had 100 slaves or more. Not surprisingly, therefore, he is very pro-slavery. He runs his own personal economy, and it's what he believes. Now, we're going to be talking in our next lecture about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, which will result in John Brown's execution. We'll say nothing more about that now. I'll save that interesting tidbit for later about what that was all about. But Ruffin is going to attend that execution. Interestingly, he struggled to get Virginia state legislators to properly entertain the idea of secession, which he was really pushing them to do. So he actually then went to states south to South Carolina, where they're a little more hot-headed at the time, and started pushing them for secession. And interestingly, when we get to the first shot of the Civil War, Fort Sumter, he will fire that shot. Ruffin is so hardcore that he is going to, at the end of the war, when the South loses, he is going to wrap himself up in a Confederate flag, lay on the floor of his house, and shoot himself in the head. Suicide. And so Ruffin is nicknamed that he is the one who fired the first and the last shot of the American Civil War. And again, there is some debate over whether or not he actually did fire the first cannon at Fort Sumter. He very well might have. And some accounts say that he did. So very possibly so. Now, we'll end this lecture by going over what is the impact of these fire eaters, and the impact on American politics, the impact on future course of events. Well, as I mentioned, these guys were radical, and in a lot of ways, they're not representative of the South. These are the most hardcore Southerners. A lot of Southerners, and I'm not talking moderate Southerners, I'm talking about even those who were not moderate, wanted to keep arm's distance from these guys because they thought they were a little bit too extreme even for them. And so you need to understand that these guys were not universally accepted in Southern society. And a lot of people thought that they were just dangerous, and their ideas were reckless and didn't want anything to do with them. But we can't ignore the fact that these fire eaters did very much drive the vehicle of the South in the late 1850s and 1860, 1861. They're going to play a huge role in rallying the South, Southern politicians, the Southern people into supporting secession. And you could say that the Republican Party, and to a lesser extent Northern Democrats and abolitionists, pushed them to do exactly that. The Republicans, not all of them were against the idea of a fight over the future of slavery. Abolitionists sure didn't mind having a fight. So in a lot of ways, both these extreme sides, the abolitionists on one side, fire eaters on the other, really are the two groups most responsible for stoking the fire and the tensions between North and South. And both sides wanted to fight. Abolitionists wanted to fight in order to fight to create a new American Union, which would see no slavery. Fire eaters looking for a fight to protect the institution of slavery. And that fight is going to come. So don't underestimate the Fire Eaters and their impact in the outbreak of the Civil War. They are, at the end of the day, the ones who are going to be the biggest cheerleaders of the secessionist movement when we come to 1860, 1861. They're going to play a huge role in making that happen and the war itself breaking out. So they play a very vital role in the outbreak of the American Civil War. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've learned something from this lecture. And again, please feel free to like my lecture for today, and also if you could please subscribe to my channel. That would be fantastic. All right, thank you, and next lecture is coming up soon. Stay tuned.